In the latest episode of our podcast, Into the Killing, we cover the case of a 15-year-old boy who went missing in 1987. The police had a suspect. It was a man who was first convicted of murdering a child when he was just 15 years old. The police also believe that the man killed other young men. Yet, it would still take a decade before there was a break in the case of the missing 15-year-old boy. You can find Into the Killing on Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, Stitcher, and anywhere you find great podcasts. Before we start today's video, we just want to take a few moments to talk about our wonderful sponsor, Magellan TV. Magellan TV has the best collection of documentaries on the planet. An excellent documentary I just watched is called Finding Lee. In 2004, 21-year-old Lee Matthews was kidnapped from the parking lot of her university. A ransom was demanded and her father paid it, but the results were still tragic. Magellan TV also has some amazing history documentaries. The documentary, Ancient Angkor, City of Temples, is fascinating. It has some footage of ruins that are so amazing you'll want to book a trip to Cambodia while you're watching the documentary. Magellan TV has been a longtime supporter of Criminally Listed, and we couldn't be more thankful. There's never been a better time to get Magellan TV because they have an amazing deal for Criminally Listed viewers. You can get 30% off an annual membership, which means you can get access to over 3,000 documentaries for just $3.50 a month. Just go to try.magellantv.com/criminallylisted to claim your discounted annual membership today. If you have been watching with me and you let your subscription lapse, you can still claim this offer. So please check out Magellan TV today because you'll find something great to watch and you'll be supporting Criminally Listed in the process. Number 3. Richard Smith. The Smith family lived in Pudsey, which is a small market town that is part of the Leeds metropolitan area in England. Most people thought that the Smiths were just a normal family. Richard Smith was a quantity estimator and his wife, Claire, worked as an accounts manager at a diesel company in Pudsey. They had a son named Ben who played soccer. In December 2007, the family experienced a tragedy. Claire had been pregnant, but she miscarried at 21 weeks. It was a boy whom they had named Jake. It was a tough loss for the family, but they did their best to move on. Every year, at the anniversary of the miscarriage, Richard and Claire took time off from work. Then, in late 2009, the family got some good news. Claire was pregnant again. In the summer of 2010, she gave birth to a son, Aaron. Everyone who knew the family thought that Aaron's birth helped heal the wounds from the loss of Jake. In early 2011, they moved into a nice 3-bedroom house in Pudsey. Ben continued to play soccer and Richard was the coach. Richard told people that he hoped one day his boy would play for his favorite team, Leeds United. On Friday, December 9th, 2011, 37-year-old Richard, 36-year-old Claire, 9-year-old Ben, and 1-year-old Aaron went to the soccer club's Christmas party. They left the Christmas party at around 11 p.m. No one saw the family on Saturday. On Sunday morning, Richard was seen washing his car outside the family's home, which wasn't too unusual for a Sunday. That evening, a neighbor noticed something odd on one of the family's windows. It looked like soot. The neighbor called Richard's brother, and he and his best friend went over to the family's home. They got inside and instantly noticed that there was a fire slowly burning somewhere inside the house. In the main floor bedroom, they found the dead bodies of the family. Richard's brother immediately called for help. The fire was put out and the bodies were retrieved from the house. Based on the autopsy reports and clues around the house, the police did their best to figure out what happened. On Friday, December 9th, the family attended the Christmas party. No one noticed anything amiss with the family. Then, most likely, sometime on Saturday, Richard stabbed Claire in the chest and strangled her with a scarf. Richard also stabbed 1-year-old Aaron once in the chest. 9-year-old Ben had been stabbed in the neck, the chest, and the arm. However, unlike his mother and brother, his wounds weren't fatal. It's believed that Richard attacked his family sometime on Saturday because no one saw them that day. Also, Ben had an advent calendar and the door for Saturday was closed. On Sunday morning, Richard washed his car. Then, he either gathered up his family and placed them in the bedroom, or his family was already in the bedroom and he joined them. He then started the slow-burning fire. Claire's body was in a sleeping position. Ben was draped across his mother's body and Aaron was between them. In the crook of Claire's elbow was the box that contained Jake's ashes. Then Richard had his arms around his family. As we previously mentioned, Ben's stab wounds had not been fatal. Instead, he either died from smoke inhalation, or he was suffocated with a pillow, or his father pressed his face against his chest until he stopped breathing. Richard had stabbed himself in the neck, but the wound was not fatal. He died from smoke inhalation and from breathing in the gases from the fire. Everyone who knew the family was shocked by the murder-suicide. No one is sure why Richard wiped out his entire family. Richard and Claire were not having any marital problems. Also, they weren't in any financial trouble. There is speculation that Richard had a mental breakdown after the miscarriage. The murders happened nearly 4 years to the day of the miscarriage. Richard did not leave a note, so we'll probably never know exactly why he committed these horrible acts. Number 2. Henri Valburg. In the mid-1970s, the Valburg family lived in Paris, France. Henri Valburg and his wife, Micheline, had 2 children, Gilles and Didier. Henri had been a successful businessman, but he had run into financial trouble. He had to close his surveying business and fire his 6 employees. He then started a cosmetics business, but it also failed. On February 21, 1976, 23-year-old Gilles and 15-year-old Didier returned from a ski trip. Early the next morning, neighbors heard a series of loud bangs, but they weren't sure what was causing the noises. Later that morning, a neighbor knocked on the family's door and it opened. The neighbor saw a family member slumped in an armchair. They called the police, and the police came to the family's home. In the living room, they found the dead bodies of 23-year-old Gilles and 15-year-old Didier. Also in the living room were the dead bodies of Micheline's 74-year-old mother, Mrs. Georges Robert, and Henri's aunt, 72-year-old Alice. They were all blindfolded, and they had been shot once in the heart. On the bed in the master bedroom, the police found the bodies of 50-year-old Henri and 52-year-old Micheline. Micheline had also been shot in the heart. Henri was dead from a gunshot wound to the head. The gun was lying next to Henri. There are different reports as to what gun was used, but it was either a .357 Magnum or a carbine. The police found a note written by Henri. He said that the family had talked about it all night, and they decided it was better to die than face the dishonor of bankruptcy. He wrote, "We decided together to leave the society." So Henri killed them and then took his own life. A police spokesperson said, "Call it collective suicide, or rather, 5 murders by submission, with the killer taking his own life." Number 1. George Hassell. Farwell is a small town in Texas that is situated on the border of New Mexico. In December 1926, it was home to 38-year-old George Hassell and his wife, 41-year-old Susie. They lived on a farm in the town. Susie had 9 children who were fathered by her first husband, Thomas. Thomas had died several years earlier. One day, while Thomas and George were working on a field on the family's farm, Thomas was supposedly kicked to death by a mule. In December 1926, all but 2 of Susie's children lived on the farm in Farwell. Her eldest child, Nora, lived in California with her husband. Her second oldest, 21-year-old Elton, was working in New Mexico. Just weeks before Christmas 1926, people in the town noticed that Susie and the children weren't around. George explained that they had moved back to Oklahoma, which is where they moved from 2 years earlier. Around the same time that the family went missing, George started selling off items that the family had. Then, on December 23, 1926, George was rushed to the hospital. He was near death after stabbing himself several times. While he was in the hospital, the police looked around his home. They noticed some blood that didn't appear to have come from George. They also found a freshly dug cellar just off the kitchen. They thought it was odd that the family would dig a cellar only to move away days later. The sheriff's department checked the cellar. It wasn't long before they uncovered a body buried in the floor. Soon, they uncovered 8 more bodies. The bodies were 41-year-old Susie and 8 of her 9 children, 21-year-old Elton, 15-year-old Virgil, 13-year-old Maudie, 11-year-old Russell, 7-year-old David, 6-year-old Johnny, 4-year-old Nanny Martha, and finally, 22-month-old Samuel. The sheriff went to George's hospital room and confronted him about the discovery of the bodies. George said, "I did it. I did it." George then explained what happened. On December 5th, about 3 weeks earlier, he and Susie got into a fight. She had accused him of sexually abusing his eldest stepdaughter, who was also his niece, 13-year-old Maudie. George said that he picked up a ball-peen hammer and hit Susie twice in the face. He then strangled her. He ended up killing her by striking her in the head with an axe. He then set to work strangling the children. He managed to strangle the 6 youngest without too much trouble. Then, when he got to 11-year-old Russell, the boy put up a fight, and this woke up 15-year-old Virgil. As he was choking Russell, Virgil was fighting him. George said that he grabbed a shotgun and shot Virgil, killing him. He then finished off Russell with the axe. He then buried the bodies in the cellar that he and the children had dug out days earlier. He then waited for Elton, who was away working in New Mexico, to return home. Elton arrived at the family's farm 3 days after the murders. George told him that his family had gone out of town to visit a relative. That night, he and Elton stayed up late playing cards. After Elton went to bed, George shot him in the head with a shotgun. Once George had confessed to the murders of his wife and stepchildren, he started talking about his early life. And what he told the police shocked them. George was constantly in trouble as a youth. He first thought about committing a mass murder when he was 17. He wanted to kill his stepmother and her family members because he heard that his stepmother was poisoning his father. He had even planned out the murders. But he had gotten too drunk the night before and he slept in. Later that same day, he was arrested for stealing money from work, and he did some time in jail. George said that when he was 18 years old, he got married, and his wife gave birth to a son. But he didn't stick around long, and he joined the army. George said he ended up deserting the army, and then he enlisted in the Navy, where he served as a cook. He was eventually arrested for deserting the army, and he served 2 years in prison. After he got out, he tried to reconcile with his wife, but she wanted nothing to do with him. George said that he met a woman who had a young son. The boy reminded him of his son, and he and the woman became romantically involved. They eventually moved to Whittier, California. They adopted 2 children who were orphans from Colorado. In June 1917, about 9 years before the murders in Farwell, he was working in the oil fields in Whittier. The United States had recently entered World War I. George said that he and his wife had an argument about him enlisting. During the argument, he ended up strangling her and clubbing her to death with an axe. He then used a ligature to strangle the 3 children. After killing the family, he spent 3 days burying them in a cellar. He told anyone who was looking for them that they had moved to San Francisco. After burying the bodies, George moved away from Whittier. He eventually ended up in Blair, Oklahoma, where his brother Thomas and his wife Susie lived. One day, while he was working alone in the fields with Thomas was supposedly kicked to death by a mule. The authorities thought it was an odd story, but the family accepted the explanation for Thomas's death, so they didn't pursue an investigation. George said that after his brother's death, he reviewed the Bible, and he determined it was okay to marry Susie, so he did. They ended up moving to Farwell, Texas. Nearly 2 years later, he murdered Susie and his 8 stepchildren, who were also his nieces and nephews. The police were shocked by George's confessions. They couldn't believe that he had killed 2 of his families. They asked him for more details about the first family he had killed about 10 years earlier. George refused to reveal the name of his former common-law wife. He also didn't remember the address where they lived. The police got in contact with the investigators in Whittier, California. At first, they didn't believe George because they couldn't find any record of a Hassell family living there in 1917. George's story made headlines across the country. One woman who read the story was Gertrude Hoffman, who lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Her sister, Martha Vogel, had been living with a man named George Hassell in Whittier, and she went missing about 10 years earlier. Then Hoffman saw a photograph of George, and she knew that the man was her sister's common-law partner. Hoffman had visited them in Whittier shortly before her sister disappeared. So she contacted the police in Farwell. Based on her information, the police in Whittier traced the location where the family had lived, but the house had been demolished. Some neighbors remembered that a family had lived there about 10 years earlier, but they had disappeared one night. Also, their last name wasn't Hassell, it was the Baker family. The police in Farwell asked George what name he was using in Whittier, and he said G.G. Baker. The police asked George to draw a sketch as to where he buried the bodies on the property. He did, and the police in Whittier started digging. They found the remains of a woman and 3 children, a boy who was about 8 years old, a girl who was about 5 years old, and an infant around the age of 1. They all had a piece of cloth tied around their necks, and the woman, presumably Marie Vogel, had been clubbed to death with what appeared to be an axe. It was decided that, even though George had confessed to 13 murders, he would only be tried for 1. That way, if he was somehow acquitted, he could be tried for the other 12 murders. George Hassell went to trial a few weeks after he was arrested in January 1927 for the murder of his eldest stepson, 21-year-old Eldon Hassell. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before they found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. George Hassell was scheduled to die in the electric chair on February 10, 1928, about 14 months after the murders in Farwell. He was calm and jovial as he sat on death row. George did not have any specific requests for his last meal. When he was asked if he had a last statement, he said, "I would like to announce to the world that I am prepared to meet my God. I have made my confession to God and man. Man does not understand it all, but God does." On February 10, 1928, at 12:29 a.m., the first jolt of electricity entered 39-year-old George Hassell's body. 8 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. The police said that they suspect that George may have committed more than the 13 murders he confessed to. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out our podcast, Into the Killing. In our latest episode, we look at a suspected serial killer who almost got away with murder. You can find Into the Killing on Deezer, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.